Imagine standing at the edge of a vast canyon in the American Southwest, where rust-red sandstone cliffs rise against an endless turquoise sky, and there, tucked into a shadowed alcove, hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, you see the ghostly remains of stone villages that have stood silent for more than 700 years. These magnificent cliff dwellings, with their crumbling walls and empty doorways, once echoed with the sounds of children playing and corn being ground on stone slabs. But something happened in the late 1200s that caused one of ancient North America's most skilled builders to walk away from their ancestral homeland and never return. Tonight, we journey back through the centuries to explore the Anasazi disappearance mystery, seeking answers in the whisper of desert wind and the patient testimony of tree rings, pottery shards, and bones buried beneath the silent dust. Before we journey back to the ancient American Southwest together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of history, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Long before the great stone villages rose against canyon walls, before the towers of Chaco and the cliff palaces of Mesa, Verde, there was a simpler time in the Four Corners region of the American Southwest. The land where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet at a single point is a place of stark and haunting beauty. Picture yourself there now, perhaps 1,500 years before the present day, as the first light of morning spills across a landscape of sandstone mesas, deep-cut canyons, and high desert plateaus scattered with juniper and piñon pine. The air is thin and dry, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of a stream running through red rock. This is a land of contrasts and extremes. In summer, the midday sun beats down with fierce intensity, heating the sandstone until it radiates warmth long into the evening hours. The temperature can soar well above 100 degrees in the lower elevations, and the air shimmers with heat waves that make distant mesas seem to float above the desert floor. Then, as the sun sinks toward the horizon, the temperature drops rapidly, and the night brings blessed coolness beneath a canopy of stars more brilliant than anything you might see in our modern light-polluted world. Winter brings its own challenges. Snow falls on the higher mesas, blanketing the piñon and juniper forests in white. The cold can be bitter, with temperatures plunging well below freezing, and the wind that sweeps across the open plateaus cuts through any clothing with merciless efficiency. Yet even in winter, the sun can warm the south-facing alcoves in the canyon walls, creating microclimates where life can shelter from the worst of the season's harshness. The people we now call the ancestral Puebloans, or by their older name the Anasazi, did not arrive in this landscape fully formed as master builders. Their story begins much earlier, in what archaeologists call the basket maker period, a time stretching back perhaps to 1,500 years before the Common Era. These early inhabitants of the Southwest were wanderers at first, small family groups who moved across the high desert following the rhythms of the seasons, gathering wild plants, hunting deer and rabbits, and slowly learning the secrets of this demanding but beautiful land. Close your eyes and imagine yourself among them. The morning is cool, and a thin column of smoke rises from a fire pit where someone has been roasting piñon nuts gathered from the trees that dot the mesa top. The scent is warm and slightly sweet, mixing with the dry smell of dust and the faint green fragrance of the juniper bushes that cling to the rocky slopes. These early people wore clothing made from animal skins and wove intricate baskets from yucca fibers, baskets so finely made that they could hold water. This skill in basketry is what gave this early period its name, and examples of their work have survived the centuries, preserved by the dry climate in the protected alcoves of sandstone cliffs. The baskets they created were true works of art, woven with such precision that they could serve purposes we might not expect. Some baskets were lined with pitch from piñon trees, making them completely waterproof. These could be used to carry water from distant springs back to camp, or to store water for drinking and cooking. Other baskets were woven so tightly that they could be used for cooking, with heated stones dropped into liquid to bring it to a boil. The weaving patterns were not random but followed traditional designs passed down through generations, geometric shapes and symbolic images that carried meaning we can only guess at today. The basket maker people lived simply at first. They sheltered in natural caves and rock overhangs, building simple structures of poles and brush to keep out the wind and rain. These rock shelters offered protection from the elements while requiring minimal construction effort. The overhanging cliffs kept rain and snow off the living areas, and the thermal mass of the stone helped moderate temperature extremes. In summer, the deep shade of the alcoves provided relief from the scorching sun. In winter, fires built against the back wall of a shelter would radiate warmth throughout the protected space. But something remarkable was happening during this time, something that would change their world forever. Corn had been cultivated in Mexico for thousands of years, and through networks of trade and migration, the knowledge of farming was slowly spreading northward. By around 1500 BCE, the early people of the Four Corners had begun planting small gardens of corn and squash in the sandy soil near seasonal streams. This shift from pure hunting and gathering to farming was gradual, unfolding over many generations. Imagine a grandmother showing her grandchildren how to plant the seeds, pushing them gently into the red earth with a digging stick, explaining how to read the sky for signs of rain. The corn they grew was different from what we know today, with smaller ears and harder kernels, but it was nourishing and could be dried and stored for the long winter months when little else was available. The earliest corn varieties were not well suited to the Southwest's climate. They had evolved in the warmer, wetter regions of Mexico and required adaptation to thrive in the Four Corners. Over centuries of careful selection, the basket maker people developed varieties that could mature in the shorter growing season, tolerate the temperature extremes, and produce yields even with limited water. This was agricultural science conducted through patient observation and experimentation over many generations, even though the practitioners did not think of it in those terms. The introduction of farming began to tie these people to specific places in new ways. You cannot plant a garden and then wander away, not if you want to harvest what you have sown. And so the basket maker people began to settle down, building more permanent homes and staying in one place through the growing season. They dug shallow pits into the ground and constructed simple dwellings above them, with walls of poles and mud and roofs of brush. These pit houses were cool in summer and warm in winter, the earth itself providing insulation against the extremes of the desert climate. The construction of a pit house was a community effort. First, a circular or rectangular pit would be dug into the earth, usually 2 to 4 feet deep. The excavated soil was piled around the edges to form low walls. Then, wooden posts were set into the floor around the perimeter, leaning inward to support a roof of smaller branches, bark, and finally a thick layer of packed earth. A central hearth provided heat and light, with smoke rising to a hole in the roof that also served as the main entrance. Ladders made from notched logs allowed people to climb down into the interior. Inside these early pit houses, life unfolded in patterns that would be familiar to people anywhere. Families gathered around the fire for meals, sharing food and conversation as the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. Children played with simple toys, perhaps dolls made from corn cobs or animals carved from bone. Adults worked at their crafts, making tools and clothing and the beautiful baskets that gave the period its name. And at night they slept on mats woven from plant fibres, covered with animal skins against the cold that seeped up from the earth floor. As the centuries passed, their settlements grew. Small family groups became larger communities, and the techniques of building and farming were refined and passed down through generations. By around 500 CE, the people had entered what archaeologists call Basket Maker III, a period marked by significant changes in how they lived. Villages now contain dozens of pit houses clustered together, their roofs just above ground level, smoke drifting up from central hearths into the clear desert air. The Basket Maker III period saw the introduction of 2 technologies that would transform daily life. The first was the bow and arrow, which gradually replaced the atlatl or spear thrower that hunters had used for thousands of years. The bow was more accurate at longer ranges and could be fired more quickly, making hunting more efficient and increasing the supply of meat available to the communities. The second innovation was pottery. This was also when pottery first appeared among the ancestral Puebloans. Before pottery, People had stored food and water in baskets lined with pitch or in animal skins. But clay vessels were stronger and more versatile. They could be placed directly over a fire for cooking, allowing new foods to be prepared and new flavors to emerge. The first pots were simple and plain, made by coiling ropes of clay and smoothing them together. But even these early vessels represented a profound technological advance. Picture a woman sitting in the shade of her pit house, her hands covered in wet grey clay as she builds up the walls of a new pot, coil by coil. Her children play nearby, and the sound of their laughter drifts across the village. She has learned this craft from her mother, who learned it from her mother before her. The pot she is making will be used to cook corn and beans, the staple foods that sustain her family through the year. When it is finished and dried and fired in a bed of hot coals, it will be decorated with simple geometric designs that mark it as the work of her people. The clay for pottery came from deposits scattered across the landscape, each source producing clay with slightly different properties and colours. Potters learned which clays worked best for different purposes, which required more tempering material mixed in to prevent cracking, which produced the smoothest surfaces for decoration. This knowledge was practical and specific, accumulated through generations of trial and error, and it was passed down as carefully as any sacred teaching. The firing of pottery was an art in itself. Pots had to be thoroughly dried before firing, or the steam from residual moisture would cause them to crack or even explode. The fire had to reach high temperatures and maintain them long enough for the clay to fully transform into ceramic, but not so hot that the vessels would warp or melt. Controlling these variables without thermometers or modern kilns required deep experience and careful attention. A skilled potter could tell by the colour of the flames and the appearance of the vessels when the firing was complete. The basket maker period laid the foundation for everything that would follow. These early farmers and basket weavers and pit house builders were developing the skills, the social organisation, and the spiritual practices that would eventually produce one of the most remarkable civilizations in ancient North America. They did not know what heights their descendants would reach, could not imagine the great stone cities that would rise from the canyon floors and cliffsides. They knew only their own lives, their own struggles and joys, their own children growing up in the red rock country they called home. The spiritual life of the basket maker people is harder to reconstruct than their material culture, but we can glimpse it through certain artifacts and practices. Burials from this period often include grave goods, objects placed with the deceased for use in an afterlife. These might include tools, jewellery, baskets, and pottery, suggesting a belief that death was not an ending but a transition to another form of existence. The care taken in preparing bodies for burial speaks to respect for the dead and beliefs about what awaited them. Rock art from the basket maker period shows figures that may represent supernatural beings, shamans in states of spiritual ecstasy, or scenes from myths and legends now lost to us. Some images seem to depict ceremonies or rituals, with groups of figures arranged in deliberate patterns. Others show animals that may have been considered spiritually powerful, including snakes, birds, and the bighorn sheep that still inhabit the canyon country today. As you settle deeper into relaxation, let yourself drift back to that ancient time. Feel the warm sun on your face, hear the rustle of corn stalks in a gentle breeze, smell the wood smoke and the dust. The people of this era lived close to the earth, their lives shaped by the rhythms of rain and drought, planting and harvest, summer heat and winter cold. They watched the stars wheel overhead at night and told stories to explain the world they saw. They buried their dead with care, placing offerings of food and tools and jewellery alongside them for the journey to whatever lay beyond. The night sky would have been a constant presence in their lives, unmarred by artificial light, displaying its full glory of stars and planets and the pale band of the Milky Way stretching from horizon to horizon. They would have noticed how certain stars appeared and disappeared with the seasons, how the moon went through its monthly cycle of waxing and waning, how the sun rose and set at different points along the horizon as the year progressed. This celestial knowledge would have helped them time their planting and predict the changing of the seasons, practical information encoded in stories about sky beings and their movements. And always, they were building, learning, adapting. Their descendants would create wonders that still stand today, stone towers reaching toward the sky, vast apartment complexes carved into cliffsides, a network of roads stretching across the desert for hundreds of miles. But all of that lay in the future. For now, there was only the quiet work of survival, the slow accumulation of knowledge, and the deep human need to make a home in even the harshest landscapes. The transition from the basket maker period to what would come next was gradual, almost imperceptible to those living through it. Each generation made small improvements on what they had inherited, refined techniques, developed new tools, expanded the territory under cultivation. The population grew slowly but steadily, and villages became larger and more permanent. The foundation was being laid for the remarkable achievements that would follow, stone upon stone, generation upon generation, building toward a civilization that would leave its mark on the landscape for millennia to come. The rise of the Pueblo villages. The centuries turned, and the people of the Four Corners continued to change and grow. By around 750 CE, they had entered a new phase of their development, one that would see them emerge from their underground pit houses and begin building above the ground. This transition marked the beginning of what archaeologists call the Pueblo period, named for the Spanish word for village, and it represents a profound shift in how these ancient people organized their lives and their communities. The change did not happen overnight. Imagine a village where most families still live in pit houses, those cozy underground rooms with their hard-packed earth floors and central fire pits. But here and there, you can see something new. Small rooms built of stone or adobe mud bricks rising above the ground surface. At first, these above-ground structures were used only for storage, dry rooms where corn and beans and dried meat could be kept safe from animals and weather. But gradually, people began to realize that living above ground had advantages too. The new surface dwellings were easier to expand. When a family needed more room, they could simply add another chamber onto the existing structure, sharing walls with their neighbors. Over time, these additions accumulated into long rows of connected rooms, the first true pueblos. The walls were built of stone, carefully fitted together and held in place with mud mortar, or of adobe bricks made from a mixture of clay, water and straw, dried hard in the desert sun. The roofs were constructed from pine or juniper beams laid across the tops of the walls, covered with smaller branches and then sealed with a thick layer of packed earth. The shift to stone construction required new skills and new tools. Quarrying stone blocks from the sandstone cliffs was laborious work, done with stone hammers and antler picks. Each block had to be shaped to fit properly against its neighbors, creating walls that were strong and weather-tight. The masons developed sophisticated techniques, using different sizes and shapes of stones in different layers to create attractive patterns while maintaining structural integrity. Some walls were finished with a smooth coat of mud plaster, both for protection from the elements and for aesthetic appeal. Walk through one of these early pueblos in your mind. The structures are not yet tall, mostly just a single story, but they stretch across the mesa top in long arcing rows. The stone walls are rough but sturdy, and the doorways are small, requiring you to duck as you pass through. Inside, the rooms are dim and cool, lit only by the light that comes through the doorway, and perhaps a small opening in the roof that also serves as a vent for smoke from the fire. The floors are of packed earth, worn smooth by generations of feet. In the corners you might see storage jars, grinding stones called metates for processing corn, and rolled sleeping mats woven from plant fibers. The metate was perhaps the most essential tool in the ancestral Puebloan household. This flat or slightly concave stone served as the surface on which corn was ground into meal, using a smaller handheld stone called a mano. Grinding corn was a daily task, usually performed by women, and it required hours of labor to produce enough meal to feed a family. The rhythmic scraping of mano against metate would have been a constant background sound in any village, as essential to daily life as the crackling of cooking fires or the voices of children at play. The cornmeal produced through this grinding was used in countless ways. It could be mixed with water and cooked into a porridge, baked into flat cakes on heated stones, or combined with other ingredients to create more complex dishes. Corn was the staple food, the foundation of the diet, and its importance was reflected in religious ceremonies and social practices. The proper preparation of corn was not just a practical skill, but a sacred duty. connecting the people who ate it to the plants that produced it and the earth from which those plants grew. But the old ways did not disappear entirely. Even as people moved into above-ground dwellings, they continued to build and use underground chambers for community gatherings and religious ceremonies. These ceremonial rooms evolved from the old pit houses, becoming more elaborate and formalized over time. They were circular or sometimes keyhole-shaped, dug deep into the earth and lined with stone. A small hole in the floor, called a sipapu, represented the opening through which the ancestors had emerged from the underworld in the creation stories of the people. Wooden ladders descended through openings in the flat roofs, allowing entry from above. These underground ceremonial chambers came to be called kivas, and they remained central to community life throughout the entire span of ancestral Puebloan civilization. Picture yourself descending the ladder into one of these sacred spaces. The air is cool and still, heavy with the scent of burning sage and juniper. The walls are smooth, plastered stone, and around the perimeter runs a low bench where people can sit during ceremonies. A fire pit in the centre provides light and warmth, its smoke rising through the roof opening to the sky above. This is a place for stories, for prayers, for the passing down of ancient knowledge from one generation to the next. The architecture of the kiva was rich with symbolism. The circular shape may have represented the dome of the sky or the womb of the Earth Mother. The sipapu, that small hole in the floor, was a direct connection to the spirit world, a reminder of the emergence story that explained where the people came from and why they lived as they did. The ladder reaching up through the roof symbolized the path between worlds, the axis connecting the underground realm of the ancestors with the surface world of the living and the sky world above. Ceremonies held in the kivas followed calendars tied to agricultural cycles and astronomical events. The solstices and equinoxes were particularly important, marking the turning points of the year when the sun reached its extremes or crossed the midpoint of its journey. Priests and religious leaders would have tracked these events carefully, using observations of the sun's position on the horizon or the way light fell through specially positioned openings to determine exactly when ceremonies should be held. By around 900 CE, the ancestral Puebloans had fully embraced their new way of life. Their villages had grown larger and more complex, some containing dozens or even hundreds of rooms. The population of the Four Corners region was increasing, and people were spreading out to occupy new areas, always seeking land suitable for farming and water for their crops. This was a time of relative prosperity and growth, when the rains came regularly enough to support good harvests, and the people had time and energy to devote to crafts and trade and the elaboration of their religious practices. The expansion of population brought both opportunities and challenges. New territories meant new resources, new varieties of plants and animals, new sources of raw materials for tools and crafts. But it also meant more mouths to feed, more potential for conflict over land and water, more complexity in social relationships. The small family groups of earlier times were giving way to larger communities that required more sophisticated forms of organization and governance. The pottery of this period became increasingly sophisticated and beautiful. Potters learned to apply a white slip, a thin coating of light-coloured clay, to the surfaces of their vessels before decorating them with geometric designs in black mineral paint. The resulting black-on-white pottery became a hallmark of ancestral Puebloan culture, and its designs grew more and more intricate over time. Spirals and stepped patterns, hatched areas and interlocking shapes covered the surfaces of bowls and jars and pitchers. Each region developed its own distinctive style, and archaeologists today can often determine where a pot was made just by examining its designs. The creation of these decorated vessels was a skilled art that required years of practice to master. The white slip had to be prepared to exactly the right consistency and applied evenly to the surface without drips or bare spots. The black paint was made from mineral pigments or from boiled plant materials, each producing slightly different effects. The designs had to be planned in advance and executed with steady hands, using brushes made from yucca fibers or human hair. Mistakes were permanent, and a flawed design meant all the work of forming and slipping the vessel had been wasted. Despite these challenges, pottery production flourished, and the vessels created served purposes far beyond simple utility. Decorated pots were used in ceremonies, placed in graves as offerings to the dead, and exchanged as gifts between communities. The styles of decoration identified the maker's community and clan, serving as visible markers of identity and belonging. A pot was never just a container, but a statement of who made it and where they came from. Trade networks expanded during this period too. The people of the Four Corners exchanged goods with their neighbors across the Southwest and beyond. Shells from the Pacific coast and the Gulf of California made their way inland, to be fashioned into jewelry and ceremonial objects. Copper bells from far to the south, from the great civilizations of Mexico, have been found in ancestral Puebloan sites, along with the bones of scarlet macaws, tropical birds that could never have survived in the harsh desert climate. These exotic goods speak to connections that stretched across vast distances, networks of trade and communication that linked the Four Corners to the wider world. The trade in shells was particularly significant. Shells from the ocean had no practical value in the desert, but they carried immense symbolic weight. They came from the water, which was the source of all life in this arid land. They were rare and beautiful, markers of wealth and status. They connected the inland communities to the distant coast, to places most people would never see but could imagine through the objects that came from there. Turquoise was another trade good of great importance. This blue-green stone, mined from deposits scattered across the southwest, was prized for its colour and its spiritual associations. Turquoise ornaments have been found in archaeological sites throughout the region, and the finest pieces seem to have been concentrated in major centres like Chaco Canyon. The turquoise trade connected communities across hundreds of miles, creating relationships of exchange and reciprocity that helped bind the region together. But perhaps the most remarkable developments were taking place in a remote desert canyon in what is now northwestern New Mexico. There, in a place called Chaco Canyon, something extraordinary was beginning to emerge. The people who lived there were building on a scale never before seen in the region, constructing massive stone structures that dwarfed anything their neighbors had created. This was the beginning of the Chacoan era, a period that would see the ancient Pueblo peoples reach heights of organization and architectural achievement that still inspire wonder today. As you breathe slowly and let your body relax, consider the patience and skill required to build a civilization in this demanding land. Every stone had to be quarried and shaped. Every timber beam had to be cut from distant forests and carried miles across the desert. The corn had to be planted and tended and harvested, the water managed and conserved. These people created beauty and meaning from the raw materials of an unforgiving landscape, and their achievements deserve our remembrance and respect. The story of ancient Southwest history is a story of adaptation, of human beings learning to thrive where thriving seemed almost impossible. The early Pueblo builders did not know that their descendants would create wonders, or that those wonders would eventually be abandoned. They knew only the work of their hands and the rhythms of their days, the faces of their families and the sacred spaces where they prayed for rain. Let the image of an ancient Pueblo village settle into your mind as you relax. See the stone walls golden in the afternoon light, the plaza where children run and play, the smoke rising from cooking fires as families prepare their evening meal. Hear the sound of manos grinding against metates, the voices of people calling to one another, the songs that drift from a kiva where a ceremony is underway. This was home for the ancient Pueblo peoples, a place of community and belonging, of work and celebration, of life lived in harmony with a beautiful and demanding land. Chaco and the Golden Age. Chaco Canyon cuts through the high desert of northwestern New Mexico like a shallow wound in the earth, perhaps 10 miles long and a mile wide. With sandstone cliffs rising on either side to meet the vast emptiness of the surrounding plateau, it is not an obviously hospitable place. The rainfall is scarce and unpredictable, the winters cold, the summers scorching and the growing season short. And yet, beginning around 850 CE and continuing for nearly 300 years, this unlikely canyon became the cultural, religious, and possibly political center of a civilization that extended across tens of thousands of square miles. The approach to Chaco Canyon today is much as it was 1,000 years ago, a long journey across stark and empty terrain. The modern road winds through miles of sagebrush and sandy washes, past isolated mesas and weathered rock formations, before finally descending into the canyon itself. There is a sense of pilgrimage in this approach, a feeling that you are travelling to a special place set apart from the ordinary world. The ancient Chacoans may have intended this effect, choosing their location partly for its remoteness and the sense of arrival it created for visitors. Picture Chaco Canyon at the height of its power, around the year 1050 CE, where today there are only silent ruins baking in the desert sun. Imagine instead a bustling centre of activity. Smoke rises from countless fires. The sound of stone hammers rings against sandstone blocks being shaped for construction. Long lines of people move along well-worn trails, carrying baskets of corn, bundles of turkey feathers, and precious objects brought from distant lands. And dominating the canyon floor are the great houses, massive multi-story stone buildings unlike anything else in the ancient American Southwest. The largest of these great houses is Pueblo Bonito, a name given to it by later Spanish explorers that means beautiful town, and beautiful it truly is, even in ruin. At its peak, Pueblo Bonito rose 4 and perhaps 5 stories high and contained more than 600 rooms arranged in a great D-shaped arc facing south toward the winter sun. Its walls were made of carefully fitted sandstone blocks, laid in distinctive styles that changed over time as builders refined their techniques. Some walls show a core of rough stone sandwiched between smooth outer faces, creating structures of remarkable strength and durability. The construction of Pueblo Bonito spanned more than 2 centuries, from approximately 850 CE to 1150 CE. This was not a project completed in a single lifetime, but a multi-generational endeavour, each generation adding to what their ancestors had built. The earliest rooms were simple and relatively small, but as the building grew, the architecture became more ambitious. Later additions rose multiple stories high, with walls thick enough at the base to support the weight above and narrowing as they climbed toward the roof. Walk through the ruins of Pueblo Bonito in your imagination. Even without their upper floors, the walls tower above you, and you can see the holes where massive pine beams once supported the ceilings. These beams, thousands of them, had to be cut from forests 30 miles or more away in the mountains, and carried back to the canyon without the benefit of wheels or draft animals. The labour required was enormous, and it speaks to a level of social organisation and shared purpose that continues to amaze researchers today. Imagine the scene as one of these timber beams was being transported to the canyon. A group of men, perhaps dozens of them, would have cut the tree in the mountain forest, trimmed its branches, and then lifted it onto their shoulders for the long walk back to Chaco. The beam might have weighed several hundred pounds, requiring constant coordination and effort from the team carrying it. They would have followed established trails across the desert, stopping to rest and drink water, sleeping under the stars at night before continuing the next morning. The journey might have taken several days, and at the end of it, the single beam was just one of hundreds needed for the construction project. The rooms of Pueblo Bonito served many purposes. Some were living quarters, small and dim, with blackened ceilings from the smoke of cooking fires. Others were storage rooms, filled with the surplus corn that sustained the community through lean times. Still, others seemed to have been reserved for special purposes, their floors and walls plastered smooth, their contents including precious objects like turquoise jewellery and ceremonial pottery. And scattered throughout the structure were kivas, both small ones associated with individual families or clans and great kivas, enormous circular chambers that could hold hundreds of people for community-wide ceremonies. The great kivas of Chaco are engineering marvels in their own right. The largest are nearly 50 feet in diameter, dug deep into the earth and roofed with massive timbers. Inside, stone benches line the walls, and 4 enormous pillar supports rise from the floor to hold up the roof. Special chambers called foot drums may have been used to create resonating sounds during ceremonies. The acoustics of these spaces were carefully considered, allowing the voices of speakers and singers to carry throughout the enclosed volume. Imagine descending into one of these great kivas during a ceremony, the firelight dancing on the walls, the sound of drums and chanting filling the space, the smell of burning juniper and the press of bodies all around you. The construction of a great kiva required planning and resources on a scale that surpassed ordinary building projects. The excavation alone would have removed thousands of cubic feet of earth, all dug with wooden tools and carried away in baskets. The stone lining had to be precisely fitted to create smooth walls that would support the earthen bank behind them. The roof timbers had to be massive enough to span the enormous diameter, and they had to be supported on pillars strong enough to bear the weight of the roof and whatever snow might accumulate on it in winter. The floor of a great kiva was typically paved with stone slabs, carefully fitted together to create a smooth surface. In the centre, a fire pit provided light and heat for ceremonies. Around the perimeter, raised platforms or alcoves may have served as staging areas for performers or storage for ceremonial objects. The overall effect was of a space set apart from ordinary life, a place where the boundary between the human and spiritual worlds grew thin. Chaco was not alone. Throughout the San Juan Basin and beyond, smaller communities built their own great houses in imitation of those in the canyon. More than 150 of these outlying great houses have been identified, scattered across an area of roughly 30,000 square miles. They were connected to Chaco and to each other by an extraordinary system of roads, straight lines cut into the desert landscape that often run for miles without deviating from their course. These Chacoan roads are among the most mysterious features of the entire civilization. Many are far wider than would be necessary for simple foot traffic, sometimes reaching 30 feet across. They were not built for wheeled vehicles, which did not exist in the ancient Americas, nor for pack animals, which the Chacoans did not have. Some roads connect directly to great houses, suggesting they served as routes for trade and communication. Others seem to lead nowhere, or to natural features like springs or rock formations that may have held spiritual significance. Some archaeologists believe the roads were primarily ceremonial, paths for pilgrimages and processions rather than simple transportation. The construction of these roads required significant labour. Workers cleared vegetation, removed loose rocks, and sometimes cut through solid bedrock to maintain the straight alignment. In some places, the roads are bordered by low walls of stacked stone. In others, they are marked only by a slight depression in the ground surface, the result of centuries of foot traffic compacting the soil. The roads often climb steep slopes without switchbacks, going directly up grades that seem impractical for regular travel. This directness, this refusal to deviate from the straight line regardless of terrain, suggests that the symbolism of the road mattered as much as its practical function. One of the most intriguing features of the Chacoan road system is the presence of what archaeologists call roads to nowhere. These are road segments that begin at a great house or other significant location and extend outward into the desert, but instead of connecting to another settlement, they simply end. Some terminate at small shrines or natural features like rock outcrops or the edges of mesas. Others seem to point toward distant landmarks on the horizon, perhaps marking sightlines to places of spiritual importance. Trade goods flowed into Chaco from across the southwest and beyond. Turquoise, mined from deposits in what is now Nevada and Arizona, was brought to Chaco in vast quantities and worked into jewelry and mosaics of breathtaking beauty. Shells from the distant Pacific coast were fashioned into beads and pendants. Cacao, the bean from which chocolate is made, travelled north from the tropical forests of Mesoamerica, and residue from cacao drinks has been found on pottery vessels in Chaco's great houses. Most striking of all are the macaw feathers and macaw bones found in Chacoan sites, evidence that these brightly coloured tropical birds were kept and possibly bred far from their native habitat. The presence of macaws at Chaco is particularly remarkable. These tropical birds cannot survive the cold winters of the northern southwest without human care. They would have needed heated quarters during the coldest months, regular feeding and protection from predators. Keeping macaws alive at Chaco would have required significant resources and effort, yet the birds themselves had no practical value. Their importance was purely symbolic and ceremonial. The brilliant red, blue and yellow feathers of the macaw were used in rituals and as markers of status. The effort required to keep these birds speaks to the importance of their symbolic role. What was Chaco? This question has occupied archaeologists for more than a century, and definitive answers remain elusive. Some researchers see it as the capital of a political entity, a kind of prehistoric state that controlled the surrounding region through a combination of economic power and religious authority. Others view it more as a ceremonial centre, a place of pilgrimage where people from across the region gathered for religious observances and ritual activities. Still others emphasize its role in redistributing food and goods, a central hub that collected surplus in good years and distributed it to outlying communities in times of need. The evidence can support multiple interpretations. The great houses, with their hundreds of rooms, seem designed to house large numbers of people, but studies of trash deposits suggest that the permanent population of Chaco was relatively small. Perhaps the great houses served as temporary accommodations for pilgrims and visitors who came to the canyon for specific events. Perhaps they were the homes of an elite class who controlled the labor and resources of the surrounding region. Perhaps they served different functions at different times, evolving as Chacoan society itself evolved. The astronomical alignments built into many Chacoan structures suggest a deep concern with tracking celestial events. Windows and doorways were positioned to frame the rising or setting sun on solstices and equinoxes. One famous petroglyph, the sun dagger on nearby Fajada Butte, marks the solstices and equinoxes with shafts of light that fall on spiral designs. This attention to astronomical precision goes beyond practical timekeeping and suggests a worldview in which celestial and terrestrial events were intimately connected. The truth may include elements of all these interpretations. What seems clear is that Chaco was unique, a place where the ancient Pueblo peoples created something far larger and more complex than anything they had built before or would build again. The great houses stood as monuments to their ambition and skill, and the roads that radiated outward linked distant communities in a web of shared culture and belief. But nothing lasts forever, not even in stone. By the middle of the 1100s, the golden age of Chaco was coming to an end. Construction of new great houses slowed and eventually stopped. The population of the canyon began to decline. The reasons for this change are still debated, but environmental factors almost certainly played a role. Tree ring data shows that a severe drought struck the region around 1130 CE, and the Chacoans may have already pushed their local environment to its limits, cutting down forests for construction timber and fuel, and depleting the soil through intensive farming. The decline of Chaco was not sudden or dramatic. There was no single catastrophic event, no invading army, no plague that wiped out the population. Instead, there was a gradual withdrawal, a slow emptying of the great houses as families and communities drifted away to other locations. Some moved to new great houses being built to the north, at places like Aztec Pueblo on the Anasazi River. Others dispersed to smaller settlements across the region. The roads that had connected Chaco to its outliers fell into disuse, and the great kivas stood empty where once they had echoed with ceremony and song. Whatever the causes, the center of ancestral Puebloan culture began to shift. Some of Chaco's influence moved north, to places like Aztec Pueblo on the Anasazi River, where a new great house was built in clear imitation of Chacoan models. Other groups migrated west toward the Chusca Mountains or south along the Rio Grande. The great houses of Chaco stood empty, their doorways open to wind and dust, their plazas silent where once ceremonies had filled the desert night with song. Let yourself drift now, breathing slowly, as we leave Chaco behind. The ruins still stand in that remote canyon, preserved by the dry desert air and protected now as a national historical park. Visitors today walk through the same doorways and gaze up at the same walls that the ancient builders raised nearly 1,000 years ago. The silence is profound, broken only by the wind and the occasional call of a raven. But if you listen carefully, you might almost hear an echo of what once was, the distant sound of drums and voices raised in prayer, asking the spirits for rain, for fertility, for the continuation of life in a beautiful but unforgiving land. The legacy of Chaco did not die with the abandonment of the canyon. The ideas developed there, the architectural techniques, the religious practices, the social organization, all these spread throughout the region and influenced the communities that followed. Chaco was a crucible in which new forms of culture were forged, and even after the fires had cooled and the people had departed, the impact of what happened there continued to shape the ancestral Puebloan world. The cliff dwellers of Mesa Verde. As the great houses of Chaco fell silent in the middle of the 1100s, other centers of ancestral Puebloan culture rose to prominence. One of the most remarkable of these was the Mesa Verde region, a high plateau in the southwestern corner of Colorado, where deep canyons cut through the sandstone and natural alcoves in the cliff faces offered shelter from sun and rain. It was here, in the final centuries of ancestral Puebloan presence in the Four Corners, that some of the most famous and mysterious structures of the entire civilization would be built. Mesa Verde, which means green table in Spanish, rises above the surrounding desert like a great stone platform, its flat top covered with juniper and pinon forests. The mesa is cut by numerous canyons, their walls dropping hundreds of feet to the stream beds below, and in those walls, carved by water and wind over millions of years, are countless natural caves and overhangs, some of them large enough to shelter entire villages. The geology of Mesa Verde created these alcoves through a process that unfolded over millions of years. The mesa is composed of layers of sandstone and shale, deposited in ancient seas and swamps long before the dinosaurs walked the earth. The softer shale layers erode more quickly than the harder sandstone above them, and as the shale wears away, the sandstone is undercut, eventually collapsing in great slabs that leave behind curved recesses in the cliff face. These natural alcoves, protected from rain by the overhanging rock above and from the worst of the sun by their orientation, provided ideal shelter for human habitation. For most of their history on Mesa Verde, the ancestral Puebloans lived on top of the mesa, not in the cliffs. Their villages were similar to those found elsewhere in the Four Corners, clusters of stone and adobe rooms arranged around central plazas with kivas for community ceremonies. The mesa top offered good farmland, adequate rainfall, and access to timber and wild foods in the surrounding forests. Life there was not easy, but it was sustainable, and the population grew over the centuries. The mesa-top villages of the earlier period show a settled, prosperous way of life. Families lived in multi-room complexes, with separate spaces for sleeping, cooking, and storage. Turkey pens held the domesticated birds that provided meat, feathers, and bones for tools. Corn, beans, and squash grew in terraced fields that captured rainwater and preserved soil. Reservoirs and check dams helped manage the precious water supply. This was a landscape shaped by human hands, adapted to human needs, lived in by generation after generation. Then, around 1190 CE, something changed. After centuries of living on the open mesa top, many of the people began moving into the cliff alcoves. They built their homes into these natural shelters, constructing stone rooms and towers that seemed to grow out of the rock itself. These cliff dwellings are what Mesa Verde is famous for today, hauntingly beautiful structures that cling to the sandstone walls hundreds of feet above the canyon floors. The decision to move to the cliffs was not taken lightly. Building in these locations was far more difficult than building on the mesa top. Materials had to be carried up or down precarious trails, often by rope or ladder. The construction sites were cramped and dangerous, with workers labouring on narrow ledges with sheer drops below. Access to water and farmland became more complicated, requiring daily climbs that would have been exhausting and time-consuming. Whatever drove the people to these difficult locations must have been compelling indeed. The most famous of these cliff dwellings is Cliff Palace, a sprawling complex of about 150 rooms and 23 kivas tucked into a massive alcove in the side of Cliff Canyon. When you stand on the opposite rim and look across at Cliff Palace, it takes your breath away. The stone structures seem to have been poured into the cave like some fantastic sandcastle, their walls of carefully fitted blocks rising 2, 3, even 4 stories to the natural ceiling of the alcove above. Towers rise at intervals along the structure, their windows dark eyes gazing out over the empty canyon. The alcove that shelters Cliff Palace is enormous, stretching more than 300 feet wide and nearly 100 feet deep at its greatest extent. The floor of the alcove slopes gently upward from front to back, and the builders took advantage of this natural grade to create stepped terraces of rooms, each level slightly higher than the one before it. The overhanging cliff above provides protection from rain and snow, and in summer, shade from the intense midday sun, while still allowing warming sunlight to reach the dwelling in the cooler months when the sun is lower in the sky. Picture yourself approaching Cliff Palace as one of its original inhabitants might have done. There is no easy path, no gentle slope leading to the entrance. Instead, You must climb down the cliff face itself, finding handholds and footholds in the rock, placing your feet on the same worn spots used by hundreds before you. The original residents used log ladders and even carved toe holds directly into the sandstone to reach their homes. Every trip for water, for firewood, for food from the fields above meant making this precarious climb. The toe holds carved into the cliff face are still visible today, shallow depressions worn smooth by countless feet over the decades of occupation. They follow routes that seem impossibly dangerous to modern eyes, traversing vertical rock faces with drops of hundreds of feet below. The people who used these routes daily must have developed remarkable climbing skills, as well as a tolerance for exposure that most of us would find terrifying. Children would have learned to climb almost as soon as they could walk, their small fingers and toes finding purchase on holds that adults might struggle with. Inside the alcove, the air is cooler than on the mesa top, shaded by the overhanging rock even in the heat of summer. The sound of the wind is muted here, and there is a sense of protection, of enclosure, that the open villages above never had. The stone walls of the dwellings were often plastered with mud and painted, some with simple geometric designs, others with scenes depicting ceremonies or daily life. The ceilings were dark with the soot of cooking fires, and the rooms were small by our standards, but they were home to families who lived and loved and raised children in these improbable places. The construction of Cliff Palace and the other cliff dwellings shows impressive adaptation to the constraints of the alcove environment. Walls were built to fit the irregular contours of the natural shelter, curving and angling to make maximum use of available space. Rooms were stacked upon one another, with ladders or narrow stairways providing access to upper floors. Storage rooms were tucked into corners and crevices, their small doorways sealed with stone slabs to protect their contents. Every inch of usable space was claimed and put to purpose. Why did the people move to the cliffs? This question lies at the heart of the Anasazi disappearance mystery, and researchers have proposed many answers. The most common theory is defense. The cliff dwellings are naturally fortified, accessible only by difficult climbing routes that could be easily defended against attackers. Some sites show evidence of deliberate defensive planning, with narrow passages, lookout points, and walls positioned to control access. The defensive features of the cliff dwellings are unmistakable. At many sites, the only access routes pass through narrow gaps in the rock that could be blocked or defended by a handful of people. Towers with commanding views of the surrounding terrain would have allowed watchmen to spot approaching enemies long before they reached the dwelling. Some sites have what appear to be defensive walls built across vulnerable approaches, with small openings that could serve as firing ports for defenders. But defense against whom? The question remains open. There is evidence of increasing violence throughout the four corners during the 1200s, with skeletal remains showing signs of warfare and even possible evidence of cannibalism at some sites. Whether this violence came from outside invaders or from conflicts between neighbouring communities, it seems clear that the late 1200s were troubled times in the ancient southwest. Other factors may have contributed to the move to the cliffs as well. The alcoves offered natural protection from the elements, staying cooler in summer and warmer in winter than exposed locations. The overhanging rock protected the structures from rain and snow, preserving the masonry and keeping the inhabitants dry. And the cliff faces caught and concentrated moisture from rain and snowmelt, creating seeps and springs that provided reliable water sources in a land where water was always precious. The seeps and springs in the alcoves were essential resources. Water that filtered through the sandstone above would emerge along the contact between the permeable sandstone and the impermeable shale below, often right at the back of the alcoves where the cliff dwellings were built. Some of these seeps were improved with stone basins to collect the water, and the dampness they provided helped moderate the extreme dryness of the desert climate. In a land where water was life itself, access to these reliable sources may have been as important as any defensive considerations. The construction of the cliff dwellings required remarkable skill and effort. All the materials, the stone blocks, the wooden beams, the mud for mortar and plaster, had to be carried down the cliff or up from the canyon below. The builders worked in cramped and precarious conditions, fitting stones into irregular spaces defined by the natural shape of the alcove. and they created structures that have survived for more than 700 years, testament to their expertise and dedication. The wood used in the cliff dwellings has provided some of our most precise information about when these structures were built. Tree ring dating of the roof beams shows that most of the major cliff dwellings were constructed in a relatively brief period, from about 1190 to 1280 CE. This means that the entire phenomenon of cliff dwelling construction at Mesa Verde lasted less than a century, a remarkably short time given the scale and complexity of what was built. Life in the cliff dwellings was centered on community. The small rooms meant that much of daily life took place in the shared spaces, the plazas and courtyards where people gathered to work, to talk, to watch children play. Women ground corn on stone metates, the rhythmic sound of stone on stone echoing off the alcove walls. Men worked at crafts, shaping tools and weapons, repairing structures, preparing for hunts. Elders told stories, passing down the histories and legends that defined who the people were and where they had come from. The domestic routines of cliff-dwelling life would have been familiar in their essentials, even as their setting was extraordinary. Meals were prepared and shared, children were taught and disciplined, quarrels were resolved and friendships maintained. The sounds of human habitation filled the alcoves, voices and laughter and crying and singing, mixing with the sounds of work and the ever-present wind. Life went on, as it does everywhere, with all its joys and sorrows, hopes and fears. The kivas remained central to community life, even in the cliff dwellings. These sacred underground chambers were built into the floors of the alcoves, their roofs forming part of the plaza above. Entering a kiva meant descending a ladder through the roof, leaving the everyday world behind and entering a space set apart for ceremony and spiritual practice. In these dim chambers, lit only by fire, the people prayed for rain and good harvests, honoured their ancestors, and performed the rituals that connected them to the powers they believed governed the world. The kivas in the cliff dwellings were generally smaller than the great kivas of Chaco, suitable for the ceremonies of individual clans or extended families rather than community-wide gatherings. But they served the same essential function, providing a sacred space where the boundary between the human and spirit worlds could be crossed. The presence of so many kivas in the cliff dwellings, often one for every few residential rooms, suggests that religious observance remained central to daily life, even in these troubled times. As you relax and listen, let yourself drift to one of these ancient cliff dwellings on a summer evening. The sun is setting over the canyon, painting the sandstone walls in shades of gold and orange and deep red. Smoke rises from cooking fires, and the smell of roasting corn drifts through the air. Children's laughter echoes off the stone, and somewhere someone is singing, a soft melody that rises and falls with the evening breeze. The people here do not know that their time in this place is running short, that within a generation or two their homes will stand empty. They know only this moment, this meal, this song, this canyon bathed in the dying light of day. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde represent the final flowering of ancestral Puebloan culture in the Four Corners. They are monuments to human ingenuity and perseverance, to the determination to create beauty and community even in the face of growing dangers. And they are haunted places, silent now except for the wind, waiting to reveal their secrets to those who take the time to look and listen and wonder. The masonry of the cliff dwellings shows the accumulated skill of centuries of stone building. The walls are constructed of carefully shaped sandstone blocks, fitted together with minimal mortar and remarkably precise alignment. Many surfaces were finished with plaster, sometimes decorated with painted designs. The doorways are small by our standards, often requiring people to duck or crawl through, which may have helped retain heat in the small rooms. These are not crude shelters thrown up in haste, but carefully planned and skillfully executed buildings, designed to last. The gathering storm. The 13th century in the Four Corners began with promise but would end in abandonment. To understand why the ancient Pueblo peoples eventually left their homeland, we must examine the forces that were building during these final decades, the environmental stresses, social tensions, and perhaps spiritual crises that together made continued life in the region impossible. The climate of the American Southwest has never been stable or predictable. This is a land of extremes, where summer heat can be brutal and winter storms can bury the high country in snow. But most crucial for agricultural peoples is the rainfall, and in the Four Corners rain is always uncertain. Good years and bad years alternate in patterns that can seem random, and even small changes in average precipitation can mean the difference between abundance and famine. The summer monsoon is the most important source of rainfall for the Four Corners region. Beginning in late June or early July, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf of California pushes northward, bringing afternoon thunderstorms that can dump significant amounts of rain in a short time. These storms are localized and unpredictable, soaking one field while leaving another dry. Farmers learned to plant their crops in locations where they were most likely to receive this summer rainfall, on slopes that faced the direction from which storms typically approached, in drainage areas that collected runoff from the surrounding terrain. Tree rings tell the story of past climate with remarkable precision. Each year, a growing tree adds a new layer of wood beneath its bark, and the width of that layer reflects the growing conditions of that year. In wet years, the rings are wide, in dry years narrow. By studying ancient timbers preserved in archaeological sites and living trees of great age, scientists have reconstructed a detailed climate history of the Southwest stretching back thousands of years. The technique of dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, was developed in the early 20th century by astronomer Andrew Ellicott Douglas, who was originally interested in finding connections between solar activity and Earth's climate. Working with ancient timbers from ancestral Puebloan sites, Douglas realized that the patterns of ring widths could be matched between samples, allowing pieces of wood to be placed in precise chronological sequence. Eventually, he was able to connect the ancient patterns with those of living trees, creating a continuous calendar that stretched back centuries before the present. What the tree rings reveal about the late 1200s is sobering. Beginning around 1276 and continuing until 1299, the Four Corners experienced what researchers call the Great Drought, a period of severely reduced rainfall that must have stressed the ancient farming communities to their breaking point. For 23 years, the skies that normally brought summer monsoons largely withheld their moisture. Springs dried up, streams ceased flowing, and the corn that the people depended upon withered in the fields. The impact of the Great Drought would have been cumulative and devastating. The first year of reduced rainfall would have meant smaller harvests, but stored food from previous years might have made up the difference. The second year would have depleted those stores while producing another inadequate harvest. By the third and fourth years, food would have become scarce, and the following years would have brought genuine hunger. People would have been forced to eat their seed corn, the precious reserve kept for planting, which meant even if the rains returned, they would have nothing to plant. But the Great Drought was not the first major dry period the ancestral Puebloans had faced. Tree ring records show an earlier severe drought from about 1130 to 1180, around the time when Chaco Canyon declined as a regional center. The people had survived that drought and continued their way of life. Why was the drought of the late 1200s different? Part of the answer may lie in what the people had done to their environment over the preceding centuries. Building the great houses and cliff dwellings required enormous quantities of timber, and the forests near the major settlements had been heavily harvested over generations. The wood for Chaco Canyon alone, more than 200,000 timber beams, had been carried from mountains 30 or 40 miles away because the local forests had been exhausted. Deforestation contributed to erosion, which in turn damaged the farmland and waterways that the communities depended upon. The effects of deforestation extended beyond the simple loss of timber. Trees help stabilize soil, and their roots channel rainwater into the ground where it can be stored. Without forest cover, rain runs off quickly, carrying topsoil with it and cutting channels that drain the land. The gullies, called arroyos, that scar the landscape of the modern Southwest are partly the result of this erosion process, and they were already forming in ancestral Puebloan times, eating away at the arable land that farmers depended upon. Soil exhaustion was another factor. The ancestral Puebloans practiced intensive agriculture, growing corn and beans and squash on the same fields year after year. Without the benefit of metal tools or draft animals, they could not plough deeply or spread manure efficiently to restore nutrients to the soil. Over time, the land yielded less and less. requiring people to farm more marginal areas or move to new locations entirely. The agriculture of the ancient Southwest was a delicate balancing act. The soils were naturally thin and nutrient-poor, and centuries of cultivation had depleted them further. The crops required consistent moisture during the growing season, but rain was erratic and unpredictable. Farmers had to plant more land than they strictly needed, hoping that at least some fields would receive adequate rain in any given year. This strategy worked in good times but left little margin for error when conditions deteriorated. The combination of drought and environmental degradation created conditions of scarcity that may have fueled social conflict. Archaeological evidence from the late 1200s shows increasing signs of violence throughout the region. Settlements began to show defensive features, with walls and towers positioned to control access and watch for approaching enemies. Some sites were built in locations that sacrificed convenience for security, perched on cliff ledges or isolated mesa tops that would have been difficult to attack but also difficult to live in. The move to defensive locations meant accepting significant hardships. Living in a cliff dwelling meant climbing difficult routes every day to reach fields, water sources, and firewood. Living on an isolated mesa top meant long walks to anywhere the community needed to go. These locations were chosen despite their inconvenience because the alternative, remaining in vulnerable positions, was too dangerous. The very architecture of the late period speaks to fear. At some sites, the evidence of violence is stark and disturbing. Castle Rock, Pueblo in southwestern Colorado was a substantial community that existed from about 1256 to 1274, a period of just 2 decades. When archaeologists excavated the site, they found the remains of at least 41 individuals who appear to have died violently. Skulls were fractured, bones were broken and scattered, and there was no evidence of the formal burial that was the normal practice of these people. Castle Rock seems to have been the scene of a massacre that ended the occupation of the settlement. The excavation of Castle Rock, Pueblo revealed a community that had been going about its daily business when violence struck. Grinding stones were found where they had been left. Tools and pottery lay scattered as if dropped in haste. The human remains were not buried but left where they fell, eventually covered by the collapse of roofs and walls. Whatever happened at Castle Rock happened quickly and totally, leaving no one to perform the funerary rites that would normally have honoured the dead. Similar evidence has been found at other sites throughout the region. Human remains show signs of trauma, of bodies that were not treated with respect in death, of violence on a scale that suggests warfare rather than isolated conflicts. Some researchers have even argued that the evidence points to instances of cannibalism, though this interpretation remains controversial. What seems clear is that the final decades of ancestral Puebloan occupation of the Four Corners were marked by fear and violence. The debate over cannibalism in the ancient Southwest has been contentious and emotionally charged. Some researchers, most notably Christy Turner, have argued that the pattern of damage seen on certain skeletal remains, including cut marks, burning, breakage for marrow extraction, and a characteristic polish from boiling in ceramic vessels, can only be explained by the consumption of human flesh. Others have proposed alternative explanations, suggesting that the processing of remains might have been part of funerary rituals or punishment of witches and social outcasts. Why did this happen? Resources were becoming scarce as drought and environmental degradation took their toll. Communities that had traded peacefully for generations may have come into conflict over access to water, farmland, and food stores. Traditional social structures and religious practices that had maintained order in good times may have broken down under the pressure of repeated failed harvests and hunger. The very foundations of society were being shaken. The religious and social systems that had sustained the ancestral Puebloans for centuries may have been among the casualties of the crisis. When ceremonies designed to bring rain fail year after year, faith in those ceremonies erodes. When leaders who claim special spiritual power cannot deliver the results their power is supposed to guarantee, their authority is undermined. The entire framework of meaning that had organized society and given people a sense of their place in the cosmos may have been called into question. Consider what it must have been like to live through such times. You have seen the rains fail year after year. Your storage rooms, once full of corn, are nearly empty. The game animals have moved to other territories, and even gathering wild foods yields less than before because the drought has affected them too. Your prayers for rain have gone unanswered, and you begin to wonder if the spirits have abandoned your people. And then comes word that a neighbouring village has been attacked, that people you knew are dead, that strangers with unknown intentions are moving through the canyons. Fear would have been a constant companion in those years. Some communities responded by moving to more defensible locations, building the cliff dwellings and fortress-like villages that characterize this period. Others may have banded together in larger groups, seeking safety in numbers. But in a time of scarcity, large groups also meant more mouths to feed and greater strain on limited resources. The social fabric was unraveling. Trust between communities was breaking down. The networks of trade and reciprocity that had sustained the region for centuries were disrupted. And underlying it all was the relentless pressure of the drought, the slow desiccation of a landscape that had always been marginal for agriculture. The collapse of trade networks would have compounded the effects of the drought. In good times, communities exchanged surplus goods with their neighbours, sharing abundance and covering shortfalls. A village with a good corn harvest might trade with one that had access to game or useful raw materials. These exchanges created relationships of mutual obligation that bound communities together and provided insurance against local disasters. When drought reduced surpluses to nothing, these exchanges ceased, and each community was thrown back on its own resources. Let yourself drift now into a deep state of relaxation as we contemplate these troubled times. The people who lived through them were not so different from us. They loved their families, they worried about the future, they hoped for better times. They did not choose the circumstances they found themselves in, only how they responded to them. And ultimately, faced with conditions that had become unlivable, they made a decision that required extraordinary courage and sacrifice. They chose to leave. Breathe slowly and deeply. The story continues, but for now, rest in this moment of pause before the Great Migration, the final chapter of ancestral Puebloan life in the Four Corners. The wind whispers through empty doorways, and the dust settles on abandoned grinding stones. Change is coming. The Great Exodus. By the 1280s, the end was clearly approaching. Village after village was being abandoned throughout the Four Corners. The people who had built the great houses of Chaco and the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde were leaving their homeland, moving south and east toward the Rio Grande and the distant mountains of what is now central Arizona. The Anasazi decline, explained in simple terms, was a combination of environmental collapse, social breakdown, and perhaps a loss of faith in the systems that had sustained their civilization for centuries. The migration did not happen all at once. It was a gradual process unfolding over a generation or more, as different communities made the decision to leave at different times. Some groups may have sent scouts ahead to find suitable new territories, returning with reports of rivers that still flowed and land that could be farmed. Others may have followed in the footsteps of kin who had already departed, joining relatives who had established themselves in new locations. The decision to migrate would not have been made lightly. The people of the Four Corners had deep roots in their homeland. Their ancestors were buried there. Their sacred sites were there. Their entire understanding of the world was tied to the landscape they knew. To leave meant abandoning not just physical structures but an entire way of being in the world. It meant becoming strangers in a new land, starting over with nothing but what could be carried. Imagine a family preparing to leave their cliff-dwelling home for the last time. They have lived here for decades, perhaps for generations. The walls bear the marks of their hands, the soot stains on the ceiling from countless cooking fires, the worn spots on the door thresholds where feet have passed back and forth for years. The children were born here. The grandparents died here. Every corner holds memories. But the storage rooms are empty. The fields on the mesa above have produced nothing but withered stalks for years. Word has come of attacks on other villages, and the nights are filled with watching and fear. There is nothing left for them here. They take what they can carry. Baskets of seed corn, precious and irreplaceable, to plant in whatever new land they find. Grinding stones that have been in the family for generations. A few treasured objects, a painted pot, a necklace of turquoise beads. They leave behind what is too heavy or too bulky, the roof beams that took such labour to bring down from the mountains, the metates built into the floors, the very walls that sheltered them. The seed corn they carried was more than just a practical necessity. It was a living link to the past, the same genetic heritage that had sustained their ancestors for centuries. Each kernel carried the accumulated wisdom of generations of farmers who had selected for traits suited to the Southwest's demanding climate. To preserve the seed corn was to preserve the possibility of continuing the agricultural way of life. To lose it would be to start over from nothing, if starting over was even possible. And then they climb up from the alcove for the last time, using handholds worn smooth by generations of hands. At the top of the cliff they turn back for one last look at the place that was home. The stone structures are already taking on an air of abandonment, doorways dark, plazas empty of the life that filled them so recently. Then they turn away and begin walking, joining the long stream of refugees flowing out of the four corners toward uncertain futures. The journey itself would have been arduous. The migrants travelled on foot, carrying everything they owned on their backs or perhaps on the backs of dogs. They had no wheeled vehicles, no horses or mules to ease the burden. The distances involved were significant, hundreds of miles in some cases, across desert terrain where water was scarce and dangers were many. Children, elderly people, and anyone who was sick or injured would have slowed the group and required extra care and resources. The tree ring record shows that some of the very last construction in the Mesa Verde region took place around 1286. Sites like Quetzal and Betatakin in what is now northeastern Arizona represent the final holdouts, the communities that stayed longest before the end. But by 1300, the Four Corners was effectively empty. The cliff dwellings stood abandoned. The great houses of Chaco had been deserted for more than a century and the people were gone. The final abandonment left behind a landscape frozen in time. Pottery sat where it had been placed, tools lay where they had been dropped, grinding stones waited for hands that would never return. The dry climate of the southwest preserved these remains remarkably well, so that when later explorers found the ruins, they sometimes contained objects that looked as if they had been left only recently, not 7 centuries before. Where did they go? This question has occupied researchers for decades, and the answers are clearer now than they once were. The descendants of the ancestral Puebloans did not vanish. They migrated to new territories and merged with populations already living there, forming the communities that would become today's Pueblo peoples. Some moved south along the Rio Grande, the great river that cuts through central New Mexico. The Rio Grande provided reliable water for irrigation, and the valleys along its banks offered rich farmland. Villages grew up along the river, and by the 1300s large pueblos with hundreds of rooms were being constructed. The ancestors of today's Taos, Picuris, Jemez, Cochiti, and many other Rio Grande pueblos trace their origins to this migration. The Rio Grande offered advantages that the Four Corners lacked. The river itself provided a dependable water supply that did not rely on unpredictable rainfall. The valley floor was wide enough to support extensive farming. The surrounding mountains provided timber, game, and wild foods, and the region was far enough from the drought-stricken Four Corners that it may have escaped the worst of the climate downturn. Others moved west toward the Hopi mesas of northeastern Arizona, where springs and seeps provided water in an otherwise dry landscape. The Hopi people, who still live in these ancient villages today, preserve oral traditions about the migrations of their ancestors, stories that describe journeys across the desert and the founding of the communities that have existed for 7 centuries. The Hopi mesas rise abruptly from the surrounding desert, flat-topped prominences with steep sides that provided natural defense. Springs emerge at the bases of the mesas, where water that has percolated through the porous sandstone above encounters an impermeable layer of shale below. These springs were the foundation of Hopi settlement, reliable water sources that made life possible in an otherwise waterless landscape. Still others settled along the Little Colorado River or in the mountains of central Arizona and New Mexico. Wherever they went, they carried with them the knowledge and traditions of their Four Corners homeland. They continued to build in stone and adobe, to farm corn and beans and squash, to gather in kivas for ceremonies that connected them to the land and the spirits they believed inhabited it. The migration was not a single event, but a process that unfolded over decades, with different groups leaving at different times and travelling to different destinations. Some groups may have moved multiple times, settling temporarily in one location before moving on to another. The archaeological record shows this complexity, with sites that were occupied briefly before being abandoned as their inhabitants continued their search for a permanent home. The Pueblo peoples who emerged from this migration were not unchanged. New influences entered their culture, new ideas and practices that may have helped them adapt to their new circumstances. One of the most significant was the Kachina religion, a system of beliefs centered on spirit beings who bring rain and blessings when properly honored through dance and ceremony. The Kachina religion may have had roots in earlier ancestral Puebloan practice, but it flowered in the centuries after the migration, becoming central to Pueblo's spiritual life. The Kachina spirits, numbering in the hundreds, represent aspects of the natural world, from rain clouds to animals to ancestors. During ceremonial dances, members of the community don elaborate masks and costumes to embody these spirits, becoming for a time the supernatural beings they represent. These ceremonies, which continue to this day, create a bond between the human and spiritual worlds, ensuring the continuation of life in an arid land. The Kachina religion provided a framework for understanding the world and humanity's place in it. The spirits were not distant and inaccessible, but present and engaged, returning annually to participate in the ceremonial cycle. Proper performance of the rituals ensured their goodwill and the blessings they could bestow. The religion gave people a sense of agency, a way to influence their fate through their own actions, even in a world where so much was beyond their control. Perhaps the Kachina religion offered something that the people desperately needed in those traumatic times, a renewed sense of meaning and hope, a way to rebuild community after the dislocations of migration. Perhaps it provided social cohesion that helped disparate groups of refugees come together and form new unified communities. Whatever its origins and functions, it became the spiritual heart of Pueblo life. As you relax into stillness, consider the resilience of these ancient people. They faced challenges that would have broken many communities. Their environment failed them, their social order collapsed, violence stalked their homeland, and yet they survived. They adapted. They found new places to live and new ways to sustain themselves. They carried forward their languages, their stories, their knowledge of farming and building, and the sacred ceremonies that connected them to something greater than themselves. The ancestral Puebloans did not disappear, they transformed, and their descendants are still here, living in the same southwest landscape, speaking languages descended from those spoken 1,000 years ago, honouring traditions that reach back to the ancient ones who built the cliff dwellings and great houses. The Anasazi disappearance mystery, when fully understood, is not really a story of disappearance at all. It is a story of survival, rediscovery and remembrance. For centuries after the Great Migration, the abandoned ruins of the Four Corners stood in silence. The cliff dwellings slowly filled with dust, their doorways blocked by falling debris, their roofs collapsing inward as the wooden beams rotted away. Pack rats built nests in the corners of ancient rooms, and owls roosted where families once slept. The Navajo people, who moved into the region sometime after the ancestral Puebloans departed, knew of these ruins and called them Anasazi, a word often translated as ancient ones or ancient enemies. The Navajo relationship with the ruins was complex. Their own traditions spoke of the people who had lived in these places before them, and some stories warned of spirits that lingered in the abandoned dwellings. The ruins were treated with respect and caution, not to be disturbed unnecessarily. Navajo families sometimes used the alcoves for shelter when traveling through the canyon country, but they did not settle in or near the old pueblos. Spanish explorers and missionaries passed through the southwest, beginning in the 1500s, but they paid little attention to the abandoned structures that dotted the canyons and mesa tops. They were looking for gold and souls to convert, not the remnants of civilizations long gone. Some Spanish expeditions noted the ruins in their journals, describing them briefly before moving on to matters of greater immediate concern. The ruins remained largely unknown to the wider world for 3 more centuries. That changed on a snowy December day in 1888. Richard Wetherell was a rancher from Mancos, Colorado, a small town near the base of Mesa Verde. He and his brother-in-law Charlie Mason were out searching for stray cattle when they found themselves on the rim of Cliff Canyon. peering through the falling snow at the most remarkable sight either of them had ever seen. There, tucked into a massive alcove in the opposite canyon wall, was what appeared to be an entire stone city. Towers rose against the shadowed rock, walls stretched in long curving rows, doorways and windows opened onto empty space. Wetherill and Mason stood in stunned amazement. They had heard rumours of old ruins in the canyons, but nothing had prepared them for this. They named their discovery Cliff Palace, and it would change their lives and the course of American archaeology. The moment of discovery was later described by Wetherill in vivid terms. Through the falling snow, the outlines of the ancient structures emerged gradually, their scale becoming apparent only as the eyes adjusted to the strange sight. The two men realized that they were looking at something extraordinary, a dwelling that must have housed dozens or even hundreds of people, built in a location that seemed impossible. They resolved to explore it more closely as soon as weather permitted. In the following months and years, the Wetherill family explored the mesa extensively, discovering dozens of cliff dwellings, including Spruce Tree House and Square Tower House. They were not trained archaeologists, and their early excavations were crude by modern standards. They dug into rooms and kivas, removing artifacts and human remains without careful documentation, selling some of what they found to collectors and museums. But they also recognized the significance of what they had discovered and worked to bring it to public attention. The Wetherills' methods would be considered destructive by modern standards, but they were not unusual for their time. The concept of careful archaeological excavation, with detailed recording of context and stratigraphy, was still being developed. The Wetherills were enthusiastic amateurs doing their best to understand and preserve what they found, even as they inevitably damaged some of it in the process. News of the cliff dwellings spread quickly, attracting scientists, tourists, and treasure hunters to the remote corner of Colorado. Gustaf Nordenskjöld, a young Swedish nobleman, visited Mesa Verde in 1891 and conducted the first systematic archaeological study of the ruins. His book, The Cliff Dwellers of the Mesa Verde, brought international attention to the site and helped establish standards for archaeological research that would influence the field for decades. Nordenskjöld's work represented a significant advance in method. He carefully mapped the sites he excavated, recorded the positions of artifacts, and preserved his findings in systematic descriptions and photographs. His collection, which was shipped to Sweden and is now housed in the Finnish National Museum, remains an important research resource. His work also sparked controversy, as many Americans objected to the removal of artifacts from their country. The cliff dwellings captured the public imagination in a way that few archaeological discoveries ever have. Here was evidence of a vanished civilization, a mysterious people who had built cities in the cliffs and then disappeared, leaving behind their homes and possessions but no written record of who they were or why they left. The romance and mystery of the ruins appealed to Americans who were just beginning to appreciate the depth and richness of their continent's pre-Columbian history. The narrative of disappearance and mystery, while compelling, was not entirely accurate. The ancestral Puebloans had not vanished without trace. Their descendants were living in the Rio Grande Pueblos and the Hopi villages, maintaining traditions that stretched back centuries. But this living connection was not always recognized or acknowledged by the early researchers and popularizers of the ruins. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed legislation creating Mesa Verde National Park, the first national park established specifically to protect cultural rather than natural resources. The same year saw the passage of the Antiquities Act, which gave presidents the power to protect archaeological sites on federal land and establish penalties for the destruction or removal of antiquities. Chaco Canyon would be protected as a national monument in 1907, and other ancestral Puebloan sites would eventually receive similar protection. The creation of Mesa Verde National Park represented a new understanding of the value of archaeological heritage. Previous national parks had protected natural wonders like Yellowstone's geysers or Yosemite's waterfalls. Mesa Verde was protected for its human history, for the story it told of people who had lived and worked and worshipped in this landscape centuries before. This recognition that human heritage deserved the same protection as natural heritage was a significant development in American cultural policy. The study of these ruins has continued for more than a century now, employing ever more sophisticated methods to unlock the secrets of the ancient builders. Tree ring dating, developed in the early 20th century by astronomer Andrew Ellicott Douglas, allowed researchers to determine the exact years when specific structures were built, providing a detailed timeline of construction and abandonment. Analysis of pottery styles helped archaeologists trace cultural connections and migrations across the region. Studies of plant and animal remains revealed details of ancient diet and agriculture. The precision of tree ring dating transformed archaeology in the Southwest. Instead of vague estimates of age, researchers could now say that a specific room was built in a specific year, sometimes even narrowing down to the season when the tree was cut. This precision revealed the tempo of construction, showing which buildings grew slowly over generations and which were built in intensive bursts of activity. It also made clear the synchrony of the abandonment, with the latest construction dates clustering in the 1270s and 1280s across multiple sites. More recently, DNA analysis has begun to shed light on the genetic relationships between ancient and modern populations. Studies have confirmed what the Pueblo peoples themselves have long maintained, that they are indeed the direct descendants of the people who built the cliff dwellings and great houses. The oral traditions passed down through generations align with the archaeological evidence telling the same story of migration and adaptation. Genetic studies have also revealed details about social organization and burial practices. Analysis of remains from Pueblo Bonito's elite burial crypt showed that the individuals interred there were related through the maternal line, suggesting a matrilineal society where descent and inheritance passed through mothers to daughters. This finding aligned with the social organization of many modern Pueblo peoples, where clan membership and property often follow the female line. Understanding why the Anasazi vanished, or more accurately, why they migrated, requires bringing together evidence from many different sources. The tree ring record documents the droughts that stressed their agricultural systems. Analysis of human remains reveals the violence that plagued the region in its final decades. Studies of the environment show how centuries of human activity had degraded the landscape, and the testimony of Pueblo oral traditions provides insight into how the people themselves understood what was happening to them. Today, the ruins of the Four Corners stand as monuments to human creativity and endurance. Visitors come from around the world to walk through Cliff Palace and Pueblo Bonito, to stand in ancient doorways and try to imagine the lives of those who built them. The silence is profound, broken only by the wind and the occasional call of a bird. But for those who listen carefully, the stones seem to speak, telling stories of a people who lived and loved and struggled in this beautiful, harsh land. The experience of visiting these sites is often described as profound and moving. The scale of the structures, the skill evident in their construction, the beauty of their settings, all combine to create a powerful impression. And underlying everything is the mystery of the abandonment, the sense of interrupted lives and unfinished stories. What happened to the people who lived here? Where did they go? Why did they leave? These questions hang in the air, unanswered but not unanswerable. The Pueblo peoples who descend from these ancient builders have complex feelings about the archaeological study of their ancestors' sites. Some welcome the attention and preservation efforts, seeing them as ways to honour their heritage and educate the public. Others feel that the ruins and their contents should be left undisturbed, that digging into ancestral graves and removing sacred objects violates the proper relationship between the living and the dead. The ongoing dialogue between archaeologists and native communities reflects broader questions about who has the right to study and interpret the past. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed by Congress in 1990, established a framework for returning human remains and sacred objects to affiliated tribes. This legislation represented an acknowledgement that the archaeological record belongs not just to scientists but to the descendants of the people who created it. The process of repatriation has been complex and sometimes contentious, but it has also opened new channels of communication between researchers and indigenous communities. As you rest in the quiet of this moment, consider what we owe to those who came before us. The ancient Pueblo peoples created something remarkable, a civilization adapted to one of the harshest environments on the continent. Their achievements in architecture, agriculture, astronomy, and art deserve our remembrance and respect. And their story, of rise and flourishing and eventual transformation, holds lessons for our own time about the relationship between human societies and the environments that sustain them, seeking answers in stone and bone. The work of understanding the ancestral Puebloans continues to this day. Archaeologists, anthropologists, climate scientists, and researchers from many other fields collaborate to piece together the story of this remarkable civilization. Each new discovery adds detail to our picture of how the ancient Pueblo peoples lived and why they eventually left the Four Corners. One of the most powerful tools for understanding the ancient Southwest is dendrochronology, the science of tree ring dating. Every year, a growing tree produces a new layer of wood, visible as a ring when the trunk is cut crosswise. The width of each ring depends on growing conditions, particularly rainfall. In wet years, trees grow more and produce wider rings. In dry years, growth slows and rings are narrow. By matching patterns of wide and narrow rings between overlapping samples, researchers have constructed continuous tree ring records stretching back thousands of years. These records serve as a calendar of past climate, revealing cycles of wet and dry conditions that affected the ancient inhabitants. They also allow precise dating of archaeological sites, because the wooden beams used in construction can be matched to the master chronology. The creation of these master chronologies was painstaking work. Researchers collected samples from ancient buildings, from wood preserved in dry caves, from living trees of great age, and from the stumps and logs of long-dead trees. Each sample was prepared by sanding or cutting to reveal the ring pattern clearly. Then began the process of cross-dating, comparing patterns between samples to find matching sequences, gradually extending the chronology backward in time. Tree ring evidence has been crucial in establishing the timeline of the Anasazi disappearance mystery. We know from tree rings that the great houses of Chaco were built primarily between 850 and 1130 CE. We know that the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde were constructed in a brief burst between about 1190 and 1280. And we know that the Great Drought struck the region from 1276 to 1299, coinciding precisely with the final abandonment of the Four Corners. The coincidence of dates is striking. The latest construction in the Mesa Verde region, as dated by tree rings, falls in the mid-1280s. The Great Drought began in 1276 and was in full force by the early 1280s. Within a decade or two after the drought began, the region was abandoned. The correlation does not prove causation, but it strongly suggests that the drought was a major factor in the decision to leave. But climate alone does not explain everything. The ancient Pueblo peoples had survived earlier droughts, adapting their farming practices and settlement patterns to cope with variable rainfall. What made the late 13th century different seems to have been a combination of factors acting together, a perfect storm of environmental and social stress. Some researchers emphasize the role of resource depletion. Centuries of intensive farming had exhausted the soil in many areas, reducing crop yields even in years with adequate rainfall. Deforestation had stripped the landscape of trees, contributing to erosion and making fuel and construction materials harder to obtain. The carrying capacity of the land, the number of people it could support, had been pushed to its limits and perhaps beyond. The concept of carrying capacity is important for understanding the crisis. Every environment can support only a certain number of people given the available resources and technology. When population exceeds carrying capacity, the result is inevitable. Either the population must decrease through death or migration, or the carrying capacity must be increased through technological innovation or importation of resources. The ancestral Puebloans had limited options on both counts. Others focus on social factors. The evidence of violence in the archaeological record points to a breakdown of the social order, a failure of the institutions that had maintained peace and cooperation among communities. Competition for scarce resources may have turned former allies into enemies. Religious and political leaders who had promised prosperity through proper ritual observance may have lost legitimacy when the rains failed to come year after year. The evidence of violence is sobering. At sites like Castle Rock, Pueblo, excavations have revealed the remains of people who died sudden, violent deaths. Skulls show fractures from blows with heavy objects. Bones were scattered and not properly buried. At some sites, There is evidence that bodies were processed in ways consistent with cannibalism, though this interpretation remains debated. For a relaxing history documentary, these are difficult subjects to contemplate. But understanding the full story of the ancient Pueblo peoples requires acknowledging that their final years in the Four Corners were traumatic. These were not peaceful times. People lived in fear, and some died badly. The move to cliff dwellings was at least partly a response to this danger, an attempt to find safety in places that were naturally defended. And yet, even in these desperate times, the people continued to create beauty. The pottery of the late 13th century includes some of the finest work in the entire span of ancestral Puebloan culture. The Mesa Verde black-on-white style, with its intricate geometric designs, represents the culmination of centuries of artistic development. People who lived in fear of attack still took the time to decorate their pots with care and skill. The persistence of artistic expression in the face of crisis speaks to something deep in human nature. The need to create beauty, to make meaning, to express identity through craft does not disappear when times are hard. If anything, it may become more important, a way of affirming that life continues, that the things that matter still matter, even when everything else is falling apart. The kivas remained centers of community life, even as everything else was falling apart. In these underground chambers, the people gathered for ceremonies that connected them to their ancestors, to the spirits of the natural world, to something larger than the immediate crisis they faced. Perhaps these ceremonies provided comfort and meaning in a time when little else could. Perhaps they helped communities maintain cohesion, even as everything else was pushing them apart. The importance of the kivas suggests that religion and community remained vital even as the physical and social environment deteriorated. Whatever doubts people may have had about the efficacy of their ceremonies, they continued to perform them, to gather in the sacred spaces, to seek connection with powers beyond the human realm. Faith, even shaken faith, may have been one of the resources that sustained people through the crisis. What finally drove the people to leave? The drought was certainly a major factor. 23 years of failed rains would have been catastrophic for agricultural communities. But drought alone may not explain why they left the region entirely, rather than simply moving to better watered areas within the Four Corners. Some researchers suggest that the social fabric had been so badly damaged by violence and conflict that rebuilding within the region was no longer possible. Trust between communities had broken down. The networks of trade and mutual support that had sustained the region in better times were gone. Staying meant continued exposure to danger from neighbors who had become enemies. Others point to possible environmental changes beyond simple drought. The patterns of rainfall may have shifted, making the summer monsoons that the farmers depended upon less predictable. Changes in the growing season may have shortened the time available for crops to mature. The land itself may have been sending signals that it could no longer support the way of life that people had developed. And there was a pull as well as a push. The Rio Grande Valley and other areas to the south and east offered better conditions for farming. Communities were already established in these areas, some of them relatives of the Four Corners peoples who had migrated earlier. There was a destination to move to, not just a home to flee. Whatever the precise combination of factors, the result was clear. By 1300, the Four Corners was empty. The people had made the difficult decision to leave everything they had built over centuries and start again somewhere else. It was an act of both desperation and hope, an acknowledgement that the old ways could no longer sustain them, and a belief that new possibilities awaited elsewhere. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax, consider the courage it must have taken to make that choice. To leave the only home your family has known for generations, to walk away from the graves of your ancestors, to venture into unknown territory with only what you can carry. The ancient Pueblo peoples made that journey, and they survived, and their descendants are still here. That is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story, living echoes of the ancient ones. The story of the ancestral Puebloans does not end with the abandonment of the Four Corners. It continues in the lives of their descendants, the modern Pueblo peoples who have lived in the southwest for more than 700 years since the Great Migration. These living communities are the true conclusion to any exploration of ancient southwest history, for they carry forward the languages, traditions, and spiritual practices of the ancient ones. There are 19 Pueblo communities in New Mexico today, stretching from Taos in the north to Zuni in the west. In Arizona, the Hopi villages occupy 3 mesas that have been continuously inhabited since the Great Migration. Each community has its own history, its own traditions, its own relationship to the ancestral past, but all share certain common elements that mark them as descendants of the cliff dwellers and great house builders. The diversity among Pueblo peoples is often underappreciated. They speak several different languages belonging to different language families, evidence that the modern communities formed from the merger of groups with distinct origins. Yet despite this linguistic diversity, they share cultural traits that set them apart from their neighbours and link them to their ancestral past. The Pueblo peoples continue to be agricultural people, growing corn, beans and squash using techniques that have changed remarkably little over the centuries. Traditional varieties of corn, adapted to the Southwest's dry climate and short growing season, are still planted in many communities. The harvest remains a time of celebration and thanksgiving, as it was for the ancient ones. The corn varieties grown by Pueblo farmers today are descended from the same plants that sustained their ancestors. Over centuries of careful selection, these varieties have been adapted to local conditions, with different colours, sizes, and growing characteristics suited to different environments and uses. Blue corn, white corn, yellow corn, and red corn each have their places in traditional cuisine and ceremony. Architecture, too, maintains connections to the past. The multi-story adobe buildings of Taos Pueblo, continuously inhabited for more than 1,000 years, are direct descendants of the great houses of the ancestral Puebloan era. The underground kivas remain central to community life, still used for the ceremonies that have been performed for centuries beyond counting. The plaza, where the community gathers for dances and celebrations, echoes the open spaces of the ancient pueblos. Taos Pueblo is perhaps the most dramatic example of architectural continuity. The multi-story adobe structures rise in terraces, much as the great houses of Chaco did 1,000 years ago. The construction techniques are traditional, using adobe mud bricks and wooden beams. The buildings require constant maintenance, with new layers of adobe applied annually to protect the walls from weather damage. This ongoing renewal has maintained the structures for generation after generation. But perhaps the strongest links to the past are the ceremonies themselves. The Pueblo peoples maintain rich religious traditions that center on the relationship between humans and the natural world. The Kachina religion, which developed in the centuries after the migration, involves elaborate masked dances performed at specific times throughout the year. These ceremonies call upon the spirits to bring rain and fertility, to ensure the continuation of life in a land where rain can never be taken for granted. The dances are beautiful to witness. Dancers wear elaborate costumes and masks representing specific Kachina spirits, their movements precise and powerful, their songs ancient and hypnotic. Drums beat in rhythms that echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. The entire community participates, either as dancers or as witnesses, united in a shared act of prayer and devotion. The creation of masks and costumes is a sacred art, undertaken with prayers and proper preparation. The materials used carry symbolic meaning, and the designs follow traditions that have been maintained for generations. When a dancer puts on a mask, he is not merely portraying a spirit, but becoming that spirit, losing his individual identity in the collective act of worship. For the Pueblo peoples, these ceremonies are not performances for the benefit of outsiders. They are sacred acts with real power, essential for the well-being of the community and the world. Many ceremonies are not open to non-native observers, and those that are should be approached with respect and humility. The privilege of witnessing these events carries an obligation to honor them appropriately. The secrecy surrounding many Pueblo ceremonies is not arbitrary. It stems from a deep conviction that these rituals have power that must be protected from misuse or misunderstanding. When outsiders have violated this secrecy in the past, through photography or publication of restricted knowledge, the harm has been real and lasting. Respect for Pueblo religious privacy is a matter of basic courtesy and recognition of indigenous rights. The Pueblo peoples have faced many challenges since the Great Migration. The Spanish conquest brought new rulers, new diseases, and new religions. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 temporarily expelled the Spanish from New Mexico, only for them to return 12 years later. American expansion brought new threats to land and water rights, new pressures on traditional ways of life, and yet the communities have endured, adapting where necessary while maintaining their core identity. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 was one of the most significant events in the post-migration history of the Pueblo peoples. Faced with Spanish demands for labor, suppression of traditional religion, and the devastation of epidemics, the Pueblo communities united under the leadership of Pope, a religious leader from San Juan Pueblo. In a coordinated uprising, they drove the Spanish out of New Mexico and maintained their independence for more than a decade. Today, Pueblo communities face the same challenges that confront indigenous peoples everywhere: pressures to assimilate into the dominant culture, loss of traditional languages among younger generations, threats to sacred sites and water resources, but there is also a resurgence of interest in traditional ways, a determination to preserve and transmit the heritage of the ancestors. Language preservation is a particular concern. Several Pueblo languages are endangered, spoken fluently only by older community members. Efforts are underway in many communities to teach the languages to younger generations through immersion programs, language classes, and the creation of teaching materials. The stakes are high, for when a language dies, it takes with it an entire way of understanding the world. When archaeologists study the ruins of the Four Corners, they are not investigating the remains of a vanished people. The ancestral Puebloans did not disappear. They moved, they adapted, they survived, and their descendants are still here. This is an important corrective to romantic notions of lost civilizations and mysterious disappearances. The mystery of why did the Anasazi vanish is ultimately not a mystery at all when we recognize that they never vanished. They simply went elsewhere. The connection between past and present is direct and living. Many Pueblo peoples today can point to specific ancestral sites in the Four Corners that relate to their own community's history. Oral traditions passed down through generations tell of the migrations, the hardships endured, the decisions made. These stories complement and sometimes correct the archaeological record, providing perspectives that material evidence alone cannot supply. The oral traditions are not simply stories about the past. They are sacred narratives that explain who the people are and why they live as they do. They contain knowledge about geography, plants, animals, and celestial phenomena that was essential for survival, and they encode moral and ethical teachings that guide behavior in the present. The past lives on in these stories, shaping the present and informing the future. The Pueblo peoples ask that visitors to ancestral sites treat them with respect. Do not climb on walls or enter areas that are closed. Do not take artifacts or leave trash. Remember that these are not just archaeological curiosities, but sacred places with living connections to contemporary communities. When you stand in Cliff Palace or Pueblo Bonito, you stand in the presence of someone's ancestors. As this relaxing history documentary draws toward its close, let yourself feel gratitude for all who have preserved these stories and places. The archaeologists who have studied the ruins with care and dedication, the park rangers who protect the sites for future generations, the tribal elders who maintain the oral traditions and perform the ceremonies, and the ancient builders themselves who created beauty and meaning in a harsh landscape, whose legacy endures in stone and story. The wind still blows through the empty doorways of the cliff dwellings. Dust still settles on the plazas where children once played. But the ruins are not dead. They are sleeping, dreaming perhaps of the days when they were full of life. And in the Pueblo villages to the south and east, the descendants of those who built them continue the work of living, of adapting, of maintaining the connection between earth and sky, past and present, the ancient ones and those who carry their blood and memory forward into the future. Mysteries that remain. Even after more than a century of study, the ancient Pueblo peoples have not surrendered all their secrets. Mysteries remain, questions that may never be fully answered, silences in the historical record that no amount of investigation can fill. These unanswered questions are part of what makes the study of the ancestral Puebloans so endlessly fascinating. We do not know what the ancient Pueblo peoples called themselves. The name Anasazi comes from the Navajo language and has been interpreted variously as ancient ones or ancient enemies. Many modern Pueblo peoples prefer ancestral Puebloans as a more respectful term, but we have no way to recover the name these people used for themselves, the words they spoke to identify their communities and their civilization. The question of names is more than academic. Names carry identity, and to call a people by a name that was not their own is to impose an outside perspective on their history. The efforts to find more appropriate terminology reflect a growing awareness that the way we speak about the past shapes how we understand it, and that the perspectives of indigenous peoples should be respected even when we cannot know exactly what those perspectives were. We do not know the details of their religion and spiritual practices. The kivas suggest ceremonies of great importance, and the astronomical alignments of many structures point to sophisticated knowledge of the heavens. But without written records, the specific beliefs, stories, and rituals of the ancient Pueblo peoples can only be glimpsed dimly through material remains and inferred from the practices of their descendants. The inference from descendant practices to ancestral beliefs is not straightforward. Cultures change over time, and the 7 centuries since the Great Migration have seen significant transformations in Pueblo life. The Spanish introduced new crops, animals, and technologies that changed material culture. The Kachina religion may have been elaborated and systematized in ways that differ from earlier practices. What we see today is the product of a long history of adaptation, not a frozen snapshot of the ancient past. We do not know the political organization of ancestral Puebloan society. Were the great houses of Chaco the seats of powerful rulers or gathering places for relatively egalitarian communities? Did elites control the labor and resources needed for construction, or was building a communal endeavor? Different researchers have proposed different models, from hierarchical states to cooperative theocracies, and the evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways. The question of hierarchy is particularly contested. Some burials at Chaco seem to indicate high-status individuals interred with rich grave goods in specially prepared tombs, but whether this status was hereditary or achieved, religious or political, is unclear. The ethnographic evidence from modern Pueblo societies suggests that hierarchy can take many forms and need not resemble the models familiar from European or Asian history. We do not know exactly what happened in the final years before the abandonment of the Four Corners. The evidence of violence is clear, but the causes and contexts remain debated. Was there warfare between communities, or attacks from outside groups? Were the massacres documented at sites like Castle Rock the result of ongoing conflicts or sudden eruptions of violence? How did individuals and families experience these traumatic events? And we do not know what it felt like to be an ancestral Puebloan, to wake in a cliff dwelling as the sun rose over the canyon rim, to work the fields on the Mesa top, to descend into a kiva for ceremonies whose meanings we can only guess at. We can study the material remains of their lives, but the inner experience of the ancient ones remains forever beyond our reach. These mysteries are not failures of scholarship, but invitations to humility. The past does not surrender its secrets easily, and some questions may simply be unanswerable with the evidence available. Part of the appeal of studying ancient civilizations is accepting this uncertainty, sitting with the not knowing, and finding wonder in what remains mysterious. The ruins themselves are patient teachers of humility. Standing in Cliff Palace, surrounded by walls that have stood for 7 centuries, you cannot help but feel small. The people who built this place are gone, their voices silent, their individual stories lost. What remains is the stone, the wood, the shattered pottery, the faint traces of lives once lived. It is enough to evoke wonder, but not enough to satisfy all our curiosity. Perhaps that is as it should be. The ancient Pueblo peoples were not exhibits to be studied and explained. They were human beings, complex and various, with their own joys and sorrows, hopes and fears. Their lives were not reducible to archaeological artifacts or scholarly papers. They deserve to keep some mysteries, some privacy, some space where our questions cannot reach. As you rest in this moment of quiet contemplation, let the unanswered questions be. You do not need to solve every mystery to appreciate the story. The wonder lies not just in what we know, but in what we can never know. the depths that cannot be plumbed, the silences that will not be broken. The ancient ones lived, they built, they struggled, they left. And now we visit their empty homes and try to imagine, knowing that our imaginings will always fall short of the reality that once was. The wind continues to blow through the cliff dwellings. The sun continues to trace its daily arc across the sky. The seasons turn as they have always turned, and the desert waits with infinite patience. The stories of the ancient ones are written in stone and soil, in tree rings and bones, waiting for those who have eyes to see and hearts to wonder, dreaming of desert twilight. We have travelled far tonight, across centuries of time and thousands of miles of the American Southwest. We have walked through pit houses and great houses, climbed to cliff dwellings and descended into underground kivas. We have watched the rise and fall of a civilization, the building of wonders and the trauma of abandonment. Now, as this journey draws to a close, let us return one last time to the ancient landscape, to rest in the stillness of the desert twilight. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a deep canyon in the Four Corners as the day ends. The sun is sinking toward the western horizon, painting the sandstone cliffs in shades of gold and orange and deep rose. The sky above is turning from blue to purple, and the first stars are beginning to appear in the east. The air is cooling rapidly, and you can smell the juniper and sage, the dry dust of the desert, the faint mineral tang of the rock itself. The colours of a southwest sunset are unlike any other. The low sun catches particles of dust suspended in the air, scattering light across the spectrum in ways that paint the entire landscape. The reds of the sandstone deepen to crimson, the shadows turn purple, the sky becomes a canvas of impossible hues. Every surface seems to glow with its own light, absorbing the day's last warmth and radiating it back into the cooling air. In the cliff across the canyon you can see the outlines of an ancient dwelling, its windows dark, its walls catching the last light of day. Once, this place was full of life. Children played in the plazas, their laughter echoing off the stone. Women ground corn on stone metates, the rhythmic sound marking the hours of the day. Men returned from the hunt or the fields, carrying the food that sustained the community. Elders told stories, and young people fell in love, and babies were born into the warm darkness of the small stone rooms. All of that is gone now, 700 years gone, beyond the reach of memory. What remains is the architecture, the mute testimony of the stones carefully fitted together, the doorways and windows and walls. And what remains is the landscape, the canyons and mesas and high desert that the ancient ones called home. The land endures, patient and unchanging, holding the ruins in its gentle embrace. Breathe slowly, and let yourself be present in this imagined place. Feel the cool evening air on your skin. Listen to the silence, broken only by the whisper of wind and the occasional call of a night bird. Watch the stars brighten overhead, the same stars that the ancient ones gazed upon as they tried to understand their place in the cosmos. The ancestral Puebloans were stargazers. They aligned their buildings with solstices and equinoxes, tracked the movements of the sun and moon, created observatories that still function after hundreds of years. They understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, connected to cycles of light and darkness, rain and drought, growth and decay. Their ceremonies sought to maintain right relationship with these cosmic forces, to ensure the continuation of the pattern that sustained all life. We are connected to them across the centuries. We breathe the same air, gaze at the same stars, walk on the same earth. Their stories may be lost to us, but their presence lingers in the ruins they left behind, in the traditions of their descendants, in the very landscape they shaped and were shaped by. We cannot know them fully, but we can honour them, can take inspiration from their achievements and lessons from their struggles. The desert twilight deepens, the last glow fades from the western sky, and the night unfolds in all its vastness. Coyotes begin to sing somewhere in the distance, their voices rising and falling in ancient melodies. The temperature drops, and you can feel the coolness settling into the canyon, pooling in the low places like water. The sounds of the desert night are subtle and mysterious. The rustle of a small animal moving through dry brush, the soft hoot of an owl beginning its nocturnal hunt, the the distant yip and howl of coyotes calling to one another across the darkness. These are the same sounds that the ancient ones would have heard, lying on their mats in the small stone rooms, waiting for sleep to carry them into dreams. In the cliff dwelling across the way, shadows fill the doorways and windows. The stones that have stood for 7 centuries will stand for 7 more, and 7 beyond that, slowly weathering but enduring. The people who built them are remembered only in fragments, in pottery shards and stone tools and the faint traces of their passing. But they lived, they loved, they created beauty, they faced hardship with courage. That is their legacy, and it is enough. Let yourself drift now into peaceful rest. The story of the ancient Pueblo peoples will continue to unfold as archaeologists make new discoveries and scholars propose new interpretations. But for tonight, let the questions settle like dust in an empty room. Let the mysteries remain mysteries. Let the silence of the desert speak its own eloquence, beyond words, beyond understanding, beyond everything but the simple fact of existence. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, the wind whispers through empty doorways, and somewhere, far to the south and east, the descendants of the cliff dwellers continue their ceremonies, singing the songs of their ancestors, praying for rain, honouring the connection between earth and sky that sustains all life. The thread is unbroken, the story continues, and the ancient ones are not forgotten. Close your eyes, breathe, rest. The desert will still be there in the morning, patient as it has always been, holding its secrets close while the stars trace their paths across the infinite sky. Dream of canyon walls glowing red in sunset light. Dream of stone villages clinging to cliff faces. Dream of a people who built wonders and walked away, leaving only silence and mystery and the eternal question of what was and what might have been. The wind whispers, the stars shine, and slowly, gently, peacefully, you drift into sleep. Epilogue in starlight. The night has grown deep now, and the desert rests beneath a canopy of stars more numerous than grains of sand on a canyon floor. The ruins sleep in darkness, patient as they have been for 7 centuries, waiting for the morning light to warm their ancient stones once more. If you are still awake, let these final words carry you into peaceful slumber. If you have already drifted off, then these words are for the dream spaces, for the quiet corners of consciousness where stories settle and take root. The ancestral Puebloans faced challenges that would test any society. They lived in a land that demanded everything of them, where survival required constant adaptation and cooperation. They built remarkable structures with simple tools, created art that still moves us with its beauty, developed farming techniques that sustained large populations in an unforgiving environment. And when their world became untenable, they found the courage to leave it behind and build anew elsewhere. Their story is, in the end, a story of human resilience. It is a reminder that civilizations are not permanent, that even the most impressive achievements can be swept away by forces beyond human control. But it is also a reminder that people endure, that cultures adapt, that life finds a way to continue even after catastrophe. The lessons of the ancestral Puebloans resonate in our own time. We too face environmental challenges, climate changes, resource limitations that test our society's ability to adapt. We too must balance growth with sustainability, ambition with humility. The ancient ones did not have all the answers, and their civilization ultimately could not sustain itself in its original homeland, but they survived, and their descendants carry forward their legacy. The modern Pueblo peoples are living proof of this resilience. They have survived conquest and colonization, disease and dispossession. They have maintained their languages and ceremonies against enormous pressure to assimilate. They continue to dance for the rain, to plant their corn, to gather in their kivas to honor the old ways. The ancient ones would recognize them, would see in their faces the faces of their own children, would hear in their songs the echoes of songs sung beneath these same stars 1,000 years ago. And so the story does not really end. It continues in the living communities that trace their ancestry to the cliff dwellers and great house builders. It continues in the archaeologists who carefully excavate the ruins and the historians who interpret the evidence. It continues in the park rangers who protect the sites and share their stories with visitors. It continues in everyone who has ever stood before the silent stones and wondered about the people who once called these places home. It continues now in you. You have listened to this story, have imagined yourself in the ancient landscape, have walked in, thought through doorways that last knew the touch of human hands 700 years ago. The ancestral Puebloans live now in your imagination, and through you their memory extends a little further into the future. That is, perhaps, the best we can do for those who came before us. We cannot bring them back, cannot truly know their individual stories, cannot hear their voices except as faint echoes in oral traditions and the patient testimony of ruins, but we can remember them. We can honour their achievements and learn from their struggles. We can preserve the places where they lived for future generations to wonder at. And we can rest now, knowing that the story is safely held, that the ancient ones are not forgotten, that the thread connecting past and present and future remains unbroken. The stars have wheeled a little further in their courses. The darkest hour of the night approaches, when all is still and the world seems to pause in its turning. In the cliff dwellings, the stones are cold beneath the starlight, waiting for the sun that will warm them again when morning comes. Sleep now. The desert watches over you with ancient patience. The spirits of the ancestors keep their vigil in the kivas they built so long ago. And when you wake, the story will still be there, waiting to be told again, as it has been told for generations beyond counting, as it will be told for generations yet to come. The Anasazi disappearance mystery is not really a mystery at all. It is a story of human beings facing impossible circumstances with courage and creativity. It is a story of loss and survival, of ending and beginning, of death and resurrection. It is in the end a story of life, stubborn and persistent and endlessly inventive, finding ways to continue even when continuation seemed impossible. Rest now. Dream of desert canyons and ancient stones. Dream of corn growing tall in summer fields and rain falling on dry earth. Dream of children laughing in village plazas and elders telling stories by firelight. Dream of all that was and all that might have been. And know that you are part of the story now, a new thread in the ancient pattern, carrying the memory of the cliff dwellers forward into whatever future awaits. Good night, sleep well, and remember, the wind whispers through empty doorways, and the stars keep their slow vigil over the silent canyons, and the ancient ones rest peacefully in the land they loved and left and never quite abandoned. For their descendants are still here, and their stories are still told, and their memory endures. The end approaches now like a canyon wall at sunset, warm and welcoming and touched with gold. Let it embrace you. Let it carry you into the peaceful depths of sleep. Breathe, rest, dream. The journey is complete.